We've been in this series in Habakkuk called Arguing with God, and I've really enjoyed working our way through this book. I hope that you've had a chance to read through it. It's only 3 chapters long, so it's really easy to read through the book of Habakkuk sometime. And just to recap, it kind of goes like this. The prophet Habakkuk argues in chapter 1, and then God answers. And then in chapter 2, he argues again, and then God answers. And now we're in chapter 3. We're going to be in chapter 3 this week and next week. And in chapter 3, Habakkuk finally kind of shuts up and he trusts in God. Okay? And if you don't know the background of the book, we've talked about it a little bit. Habakkuk basically starts off by just saying to God, God, I'm sick of everything. Right? I'm sick of the world. I'm sick of the condition of my nation. I'm sick of the condition. I'm sick of all the sin and the death and the suffering and the evil and the injustice. God, I'm just sick and tired of it. And so he brings his complaints to God, which is always a good idea. If you're feeling that way and you want to complain about something, that's good. You should bring those complaints to God. And he basically asks God, God, aren't you tired of it too? Right? Aren't you tired of it too? God says, yeah, I'm tired of it too. And Habakkuk says, well, God, aren't you going to do something about it? God says, yeah, I'm going to do something about it. And Habakkuk's like, God, don't you have a plan? And he goes, yep, I've got a plan. And Habakkuk says, well, what are you going to do? And God says, well, here's the deal. There are these people who are just really mean and nasty, wicked people called the Babylonians, and here's my plan. Here's what I'm going to do, Habakkuk. They've been wanting to attack you guys for a while, and I've protected you, but my people keep sinning, and they keep rebelling and turning their backs on me. So here's my plan. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to let the Babylonians come over and rough you guys up a little bit. Great plan, right? And so that's when Habakkuk in chapter 2, he gets around to asking God, well, isn't there a plan B? Like, okay, God, that's your plan. Isn't there a plan B? Because I live here too, and I'm sick of everything, but I'm not sick of myself, so couldn't you do something else? Isn't there another thing that you can do? And God basically says what? He says, Habakkuk, just trust me. Just trust me. I'm a good God. I know what I'm doing. Trust me. And there was another prophet named Jeremiah who has a book in the Old Testament too. He was around this same time telling the people of Israel the same thing. Hey, turn back to God. Repent, turn back to God. The Babylonians are going to come if you don't turn back to God. And so around this same time, both Jeremiah and Habakkuk are both telling the Israelites, hey, you need to repent of your sins, you need to turn away from rebellion, and you need to put your trust in God. And so there's this ongoing argument and conversation between Habakkuk and God. And he closes in chapter 3. And the big themes of the book of Habakkuk, by the way, if you haven't picked up on this yet, the big themes are, the first big theme is what Jason talked about last week. And I was able to watch his sermon on YouTube, and I'm so thankful for, you guys, we are so blessed to have the staff that we have. I'm not talking about myself. I mean the staff, Jeremy and Jason and Mike, they just do an incredible job. And Jason is he's one of my favorite preachers. Last week I was able to watch his message on Habakkuk 2:4, that the righteous shall live by faith. And man, it was just awesome. And so you guys have some special incentive to come to church even when the pastor isn't here. You know what I mean? That's kind of the dirty secret that nobody likes to talk about. You know, is, if the pastor's not here, I don't have to show up. You want to show up when I'm not here because we've got some amazing teachers and preachers who are on our staff here. And Jason talked last week about that the righteous will live by faith. That's the first big theme in the book of Habakkuk. Another one is what we talked about a couple of weeks ago in verse 14 of chapter 2. It was that God's plan is that his name and his fame would spread out and cover the earth as the waters cover the sea, that everyone would come to know about him, that everyone would come to love him. And then in Habakkuk 2:20 also, that after another big theme is that after we've gotten our complaints out to God, that we need to be silent before him, right? Let all the earth be silent before him. And so we need to be silent before God and listen to him when we pray, not just to come before him and pray and talk, but to be quiet and to listen for his answer from time to time. So those are kind of the big themes in the book of Habakkuk. And so Habakkuk does these things. He learns that the righteous live by faith. He goes to God and he's silent before God, and out of his silence before God, and this is why it's so important to have that time of silence before God. Out of that silence and out of that solitude and out of that time of reflection and meditation and prayer comes a song. Chapter 3 is actually a song from Habakkuk's heart. When you read through it in the original Hebrew that the Old Testament was written in, it's written as a poem to be sung. It's written as a song, which we don't see that in our English Bibles, but it's written as though Habakkuk is singing these things to God. How many of you are kind of artsy types? Maybe you play an instrument or you like poetry or anything. Any of you? Like, okay, nobody. Fine. Don't pay attention to me. I'm just preaching. It's okay. No, it's fine. No, it's cool. You don't have to listen, please. How many of you would say that you like artsy things, poetry, music? Thank you. A few of you. All right. Get some coffee. Good Lord. I'm doing my best up here. All right. So out of his time of solitude and reflection, births this song. And I think that that's what happens to a lot of you artsy types. When you have your time alone with God, you want to sing, or you want to write poetry, or you want to read, or you want to do something. It doesn't mean that we're all professional artists. We all have this. Our lives are endowed with creativity as we get closer to God, because God is the most creative person in the universe. Okay? So what births out of Habakkuk's heart in his time of solitude with God is a song, and that's how he closes his book in chapter 3. So today what we're going to do is kind of take a look at this song and a few of the parts of this song that I love. It starts in verse 1 of chapter 3. Let's look at it together. Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 1 says, "A prayer of Habakkuk the prophet on Shigionoth," and Shigionoth is probably a musical term taken out of the Psalms, so that's how we know that this is probably a song. And here's what he says in verse 2. He says, "Lord," and imagine Habakkuk singing this. He's singing a worship song to God. He says, "Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds, O Lord. Renew them in our day, in our time, and make them known. In your wrath, remember mercy." What Habakkuk says here is this. He says, God, I have heard about all the things you've done in the past. I've heard of your fame. I've read through the scriptures, and I read about how you liberated your people from the land of Egypt. I've read about how you parted the Red Sea for Moses and the Israelites to walk over on dry ground. I've heard of all these things, Lord, but I've never seen them. Like that was in the past. I've heard of all these things. Would you do something like that in my day? God, how often I've prayed that prayer. Like that's one of the things I pray to God a lot. And when we talk about arguing with God, one of the questions that I tend to have a lot when I argue with God is this question: God, why don't you do the things you used to do? Why don't you do the things you used to do? And that's what Habakkuk is singing out here. He says, Lord, I've heard of your fame. I've heard of your deeds. Would you renew them in our day? Habakkuk says, I've read about these things, God. I've read about how you came to your people Israel, and you came in glory, and you came in strength, and you came in power, and you set things to right, and you punished evil, and you blessed the godly. I've read of these things, and you delivered your people, and you freed them from slavery, and you provided for your people in the wilderness. I've read about these things, but I've never seen them. I've never seen them with my own two eyes. I've read about them, but I've never seen these things. God, why don't you do the things you used to do? Read all these incredible things. You ever do that? Like, you ever wonder that? You read all these incredible things in the Bible, all these incredible stories and miracles and how God was powerful and how God showed up, and you wonder the same thing like Habakkuk. Would you renew those in our day? Like, why don't you do the things you used to do? Like what Habakkuk was saying is, God, hey, in my day, everybody sins and justice doesn't come. And in my day, the wicked seem to prosper and the godly suffer. And it seems like it's going to be that way forever. Why don't you do the things you used to do? Why don't you show up like you used to? And some of you, maybe when you read the Bible, you think that. Or you pray that, or you wonder that. You say, you think, how come I've never seen a miracle? Or how come I've never seen a healing? Or how come I've never seen a revival? Or how come I've never seen judgment come upon a godless nation? Or how come I've never seen a sea part? Right? Or how come I've never seen somebody walk on water, except Jim Carrey in that one movie? How come I've never seen that actually happen? Why don't I see? I wish I was in on the action. Right? We tend to think that from time to time. You ever done that? Like anybody? Why don't you do the things you used to do. And you read through the story of like church history, and I'm going to get super nerdy here for a second, because I'm a history nerd. You read through church history, and you see these times when God moved in amazing ways throughout history. Not just in the Bible days. I mean, like, you know, in the past few hundred years, you read about revival sweeping whole cities and countries and changing cultures and societies, and God just shows up in such a degree that it's just, you read it, right? And you're like, why haven't I ever seen that? Why haven't I ever seen that? Like in church history, there are these times. One of them was called the First Great Awakening. And what's amazing to me is, from a church historical perspective, is that this has happened in our country. Hey, these things have happened in our country. This happened in the United States. And what's amazing when I read about church history is it seems like every 100 years or so, something like this takes place. The first one was called the First Great Awakening, the first revival to sweep through our country. It happened in the 1700s, before we were even a nation. It happened in the colonies, and preachers were preaching the Word of God, and people were turning to God by the thousands and the millions, and people were turning back to God, and they were loving God, and they were falling in love with Jesus. And we look back at that, and we're like, why don't we see that happen today? Then it happened again about 100 years later in the early 1800s. It's called the Second Great Awakening. A revival broke out in this country. And again, the same thing happened. People were turning to God. People were repenting of their sins, and people were loving Jesus. And then there, in the early 1900s, about 100 years later, there was this thing called the Azusa Street Revival that broke out down in Los Angeles. And it was something where the gospel was being preached, and people were turning to Jesus, and people were loving God, and people were loving their neighbors. And out of that movement came a lot of the Pentecostal movements that we still have around today in our nation. And each one of these revival times changed the face of our country. And they definitely changed the face of Christianity in our country. And you know what's exciting to me is I think we're due for another one. I really do. Because when you look at history, they tend to happen in this country about every 100 years. So we're due for one. We're due for one. And I think that we're primed for it. I think what we're seeing, and I don't know if you see this when you talk to young Christians, or when you feel this in your heart maybe too, but I feel like what we have coming up is a generation of Christians who are rising up and are not content with the condition of the world, and they're not content with the condition of our nation, and they're not content with the condition of the church, and they're not content to live on the faith of their grandparents, right? And they're praying like Habakkuk prayed, Lord, we have read about these things. We have heard of these things, but we've never seen them. Would you renew them in our day? I don't know if you feel this in your heart, but I'm feeling this in my heart. I'm praying, God, would you renew these things in our day? So it's exciting to me. And what's even more exciting is that God is always saving people. God is always convicting people of their sin. God is always drawing people to himself. But in certain seasons and in certain times in history, it comes to the point where seemingly everybody is hearing the gospel, and revival breaks out. And it seems like people are turning to God in droves by the thousands and the millions, and people are bending their knees to God and repenting of their sin, and whole cultures and whole societies are changed. Entire cities are changed because of the gospel. There have been times in the history of this nation where cities have had to fire their police department because there was no more crime. There was no need for a police department. That's happened in the history of this nation and in England. So many people came to live under the jurisdiction of Jesus that the police didn't need any more jurisdiction. Can you imagine that, right? Can you imagine that happening in this city? How many of you, like Habakkuk, long for the day? You long for the day when God shows up in the Seattle area in such a way and to such a degree that everyone comes to know Jesus. Can you imagine it? Where the entire culture of this region is changed because so many people are falling in love with Jesus and are repenting of their sins and are turning from their inward focus to outward focus, where they love God and they love their neighbor as themselves. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? Can you imagine? Can you imagine the day when we can say that the Pacific Northwest is no longer the most unchurched region in the United States of America? Can you imagine that day when we're no longer that place? When we talk to our friends across the country, our Christian friends, and they say, oh, you live up there. You live out there where there's a very, very dim light of the gospel. Can you imagine a day where suddenly the majority of the people that you work with, the majority of the people that you go to school with, the majority of the people that are at your kids' soccer practice or at Safeway or at Starbucks, the majority of the people know that their sins are forgiven and have turned to Jesus and have learned that the righteous live by faith. Can you imagine a time where you don't have to lock your doors anymore because there's no need to? Can you imagine a time where you don't have to worry about sending your kids out into the streets to play because there's no need to be worried? Can you imagine a time when you don't have to hear about a shooting on Rainier Avenue at night, or you don't have to hear about a murder in Skyway on the news, or you don't have to read about a robbery in Cascade in the paper the next day? Wouldn't that be amazing? Wouldn't that be amazing? This has happened in the history of this country. It has happened. Listen, guys, there are times and there are seasons in history when God has shown up in such a way and with such an amount of glory that entire cities are transformed. Entire regions are changed because of the gospel. And Habakkuk, here's Habakkuk. He loves God. He follows God. And he says, Lord, I've heard about days like that. I've heard about times like that. Would you renew it in our day? I want to see it with my own two eyes, God. I don't want to just live on the faith of my grandparents. I don't want to just hear about how great things used to be and how the gospel used to change people's lives. I want to see it in my day. He says, God, would you renew these things in my day? And then what he says is this in verse 3, I believe it is. He says, God, in your wrath, remember mercy. He says, I know the Babylonians are coming. I know you're sending the Babylonians to punish us, to draw us back to you. But would you, in your wrath, remember mercy? You know what he's asking for? He's basically asking for the gospel. He's basically asking for Jesus. Now, Habakkuk lived 600 years before Jesus showed up, and he's asking for Jesus. He's saying, God, I know that if you show up, you're going to bring justice and you're going to bring judgment. In your wrath, though, would you remember mercy? I know that the wage for sin is death. I know that I can't offend, and our nation cannot offend a holy and righteous God and have no consequence. I know that there's consequences for sin, but God, in your wrath, would you remember mercy? He's asking for the gospel. He's saying, God, please come in that way, but remember mercy, remember forgiveness, remember compassion and love. And you know where we see this most clearly? It's when Jesus came. We see this most clearly in the coming of Jesus. Not only does God come in certain ways and in certain times, like when revivals sweep through places, God came in the flesh through Jesus. He has actually come as one of us. Jesus, through Jesus Christ. He's come into human history. He's lived here, all right? He's been tempted by every sin that we were, yet was without sin. He goes to the cross, and he's put to death, and Habakkuk's prayer is answered. God, in his wrath, remembered mercy through Jesus. Jesus goes to the cross, and in 2 Corinthians 5:21, it says, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. The reason I love Jesus so much is because I know that I deserve God's wrath. I'm sitting here like Habakkuk, right? And I'm saying, you know what, God, I know that I am deserving of your wrath, but would you remember mercy? And I know that he has because of Jesus. God goes to the cross. God takes my sin upon himself. God endures his own justice in my place. That's why on the cross, that's why Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? He suffers where I should have suffered. He's penalized where I should have been penalized. And then he cries out on the cross, Father, forgive them. And that's me. He's crying out for me and for you. He's crying out for the people around that cross, but also for everyone who would come after. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. I'm one of those people that Jesus cried out for, and so are you. So are you. That's mercy. God in his wrath has remembered mercy through Jesus. I don't need to die and stand before God and give an account for my sin. Jesus already has. Jesus already has. And Habakkuk says, I want to see it. I want to see it. I want to see people know about this. I want to see people love the God who does such things. And then he goes on in the rest of chapter 3, and I'm not going to read every single verse, but he talks about the people of Israel being freed from Egypt, about how they were in sin and in bondage and in slavery, and how God delivers them, and Habakkuk wants to see that happen again. He wants people to experience the joy of being liberated from their sin. Verse 3, he talks about these things. He says, God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. His glory covered the heavens, and his praise filled the earth. His splendor was like the sunrise. Rays flashed from his hand where his power was hidden. Habakkuk says, God, I remember that day. I've read about it. I've read about it. You delivered your people from slavery and from bondage and from sin and from death and from the hand of Pharaoh. I've read about it. You brought them to the base of Mount Sinai. You gave them the 10 Commandments with your own hand. You wrote the 10 Commandments with your own hand and delivered it to your people. I've read about it. I've read about it, but I've never seen it. I wasn't there. I would love to see something like that in my day. Starting to see Habakkuk's heart a little bit more. Like that's me. That's my prayer. Isn't that your prayer? God, I've read about these amazing things. I want to see them in my day. He goes on in verse 8 talking about the parting of the Red Sea and the parting of the Jordan River. Talks about how the Israelites walked across into the promised land on dry land. Talks about the day when God's people had been in slavery to Pharaoh for over 400 years, and God finally frees them, and they get over to the other side of the Red Sea, and they start rejoicing. They start singing. The armies of Pharaoh were pursuing the people of Israel. Men, women, and children, old and young, healthy and sick, were crossing over, unable to defend themselves against Pharaoh's army, yet God swallowed up Pharaoh's army in the Red Sea. Did this miracle to deliver his people. And they get over to the other side, and actually when they get over to the other side, if you read through Exodus, you know that they get over to the other side and they start singing. They start worshiping God. Moses' sister Miriam leads in a worship song when she gets over there because they're so happy. They're so happy about what God has done and how God has delivered them. Guys, that's always the point of freedom. The point of freedom is worship. So we who are free from our sins today should want to worship the God who has freed us. We should want to sing out about how good he is. We should want to tell others about how good he is, how he has delivered us. The point of our freedom is worship. And Habakkuk here says, God, I read about it. I've read about that day where you showed up and where the people were astonished and they worshiped and they sang. You called 1 million people into song, into worship, and they had a church service on the other side of the Red Sea. I've read about it, but I've never seen it. I've never seen it. God, would you renew it in our day? Would you renew it in our day? And then he gets to verse 13 a little bit further down, and I love this. This is echoing the gospel. He says, you came out to deliver your people, God. You came out to deliver your people. God always shows up to save people. That's why God shows up. He shows up to save. God shows up not because we're lovable, but because he is love. Okay? God shows up to deliver people, and he does this by sending his anointed one. That's Jesus. Jesus is the anointed one of God, and through him, he died for our sins, and he saved us from the grave. He was resurrected 3 days later, and because the Father loves the Son and has saved the anointed Son, you and I can be delivered people no longer in slavery to sin, no longer in slavery to death, no longer in slavery to idolatry. We can be free. We can live in freedom. We can be liberated and delivered. And he says, you've done this through Jesus, your anointed one. And Habakkuk has one of these quiet moments before God again. He has one of these quiet moments with God like maybe you've had before. And as he's in this moment of silence and reflection and solitude and prayer, and he's drawing near to God, he has this physical reaction. Verse 16 says, I heard these things. He's talking about reflecting on all the things that God has done. And he says, I heard these things, and my heart pounded. He was getting so excited thinking about what God has done and how much he wants to see God do these things again. He says, I heard, and my heart pounded. Have you ever been so excited and also terrified and awestruck at the same time by something that you can actually feel your heartbeat pick up a little bit? You ever been there? That sense of anticipation. He says, my lips quivered at the sound. He couldn't contain himself. He had to speak out about it. He says, decay crept into my bones and my legs trembled. Yet I will patiently wait for the day of calamity to come on the nation invading us. He says, God, I want to see you. I want to see you. I can't wait for you to show up and do what you do best. Deal with sin and save your people. That's what you do best. And he says, I'm so excited. I'm anticipating this. I'm awestruck. I'm so overcome. I'm so terrified at the same time. But I'll wait patiently. I will wait patiently. You know when the right time is. And so until that time comes, I will wait patiently on you. And then he goes on to give what I believe is one of the greatest declarations of faith in the whole Bible. It's the same thing that Jason talked about last week, that the righteous shall live by faith. Habakkuk here talks about faith, and I would submit to you as well that the point at which Habakkuk began his faith was when he took his frustrations to God. The point where Habakkuk's faith really began was the point where he took his frustrations to God. Guys, I want you to know something before you leave here today, that faith, I want you to know that faith is born in adversity. Faith is born in times of adversity. Faith is born when you're not sure what's going to happen and you have to go to God. Faith is born when you are having these arguments with God because you don't know what's going to happen, or you don't feel like life is fair, or you're not sure about the condition of your city or your nation, and you want to argue with God about it. That is when faith is truly born. Habakkuk is taking his frustrations to God, and then he listens to God, and that's how his faith was built. And it grows and it matures to the point where he says, now, you know what, God, now I just trust you. I'm going to wait for the day when your salvation comes. I'm going to wait on you. I'm just going to wait. I'm not going to argue anymore. I'm just going to wait on you. I'm going to wait for the season to come when you show your glory again, like those days that I've read about. And so for us today, I know you guys are hungry. I know that you're anticipating the potluck, and so I'm going to try to cut it a little short today, but I don't want you guys to leave here without this sense of knowing that God is alive. Okay, and when you read things in the Bible and you say, wow, that's awesome, or you read things in church history about these revivals that broke out, and you say, wow, that's awesome, I want you to leave here knowing that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Okay? God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. The same God who parted the Red Sea for the Israelites. The same God that caused these revivals to break out in the 1700s and the 1800s and the 1900s is the same God that we are lifting up this morning. He's the same God that you pray to. He's the same God that you love. So don't think that he can't do it again, because he can. He can do it again. And I want you to leave here this morning with that prayer of Habakkuk in your heart. Lord, I've read about these things. Would you renew them in our day? And I want that to be our prayer as a congregation over the next year, as we're coming together as a spiritual family, and as we're beginning to see our church have a little greater impact in our community and people reaching out into our city and blessing people in Jesus' name. I want us to be a prayerful people who are praying, God, would you do the things that you did before? We read about these things that you've done in the past. Would you renew them in our day? Would you renew them in Fairwood? Would you renew them in Renton? Because can you imagine a day, and I talked about it a couple of weeks ago, but can you imagine a day when the vision that we have for our city comes true? The vision that God has given us for our city that we believe comes from Zechariah chapter 8. Can you imagine a day when old men and women sit out in the streets and they spin tales? Can you imagine a day when young boys and young girls are playing in the streets and they're singing songs and they're playing games, and it's a good city to grow up in and a good city to grow old in, and there's no more fear and there's no more sin and there's no more suffering, and people are loving each other and God is transforming people? Can you imagine that day? Can you picture that day in your mind? Because God can do it. God can do it. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. So my prayer, and I want your prayer to be, God, would you renew those things in our day and in our time and in our community? Would you renew these things in our city? Guys, God has saved us. Those of you who follow Jesus, God has saved you, but I also want you to know He's still saving you. He's not done with you yet, okay? He's not done with you yet. He's not done with us yet. So let's follow Him, and let's let our prayer be the prayer of Habakkuk. God, we've read about these things. Would you renew them in our time? Would you stand with me this morning?